Heaven sent.
Well, boys and girls, after your overwhelming support on my last video of this series, I thought it'd only be right to continue our journey into the world of crime-based gaming and explore 5 more offerings of pure debauchery. And while it's obvious that the GTA series was reigning supreme at the helm of felonious gameplay, there was still a litany of titles that were pushed into the corners of obscurity during this hotbed for anything crime-related. Through the good and sometimes complete garbage, I've taken it upon myself to seek out anything of interest from this era, in hopes of uncovering some hidden gems and maybe even discussing some of your personal favorites. So without further ado, let's get ready to step back into the dangerous world of crime games of the early 2000s, as we seek to find the chaotic highs and painstaking lows. But before we continue, grab yourself a drink, find a snack, and get ready to tuck in, cause we're gonna be here for a good time and a long time. Throughout my many visits to the video game store as a youth, there were a handful of cover arts that never left my memory for a litany of reasons. From the nightmare-inducing art of Fatal Frame to the devilishly sexy art of Blood Rain. She can suck my blood anytime. These titles stood out for their cover art for their own obvious reasons. But there was one title that especially intrigued me. While the ESRB rating system was heavily pushed at this time due to the controversies of adult content in video games, it was rare to see something as severe as this. It was my first time ever seeing a warning sticker being placed on a video game before, and for that, State of Emergency on the PS2 has been living in my head rent-free ever since. This was another title in the long roster of crime-based gaming that Rockstar Games were dishing out at the time, and is a game that is both ambitious and completely insane. The narrative of State of Emergency begins in the year of 2023. The United States government has become weakened with economic crisis, and a totalitarian governed force called the Corporation have been formed to overthrow this once diplomatic nation. Over a decade later, an underground resistance group known as the Freedom have been formed in resistance to the Corporation, sparking a national riot and beginning the game's descent into pure madness. Now, as deeply moving as that narrative may seem, the gameplay is much more shallow, but as we've learned time and time again with games of this era, sometimes shallow is good. The game begins with you picking from one of 2 starting characters and beginning your journey into the riots of Capital City. The entire basis of State of Emergency is pretty simple. Commit literally all of the crimes, whether it's arson, theft, or some good old-fashioned murder. The goal within each level is to cause as much chaos as possible, with the only restriction being in the limited time that you have to do so. You'll traverse throughout each level committing crimes that in turn rack up various points and multipliers. Vandalism and destruction award quick and easy points, while corporation and gang eliminations will reward you with an even higher score. The only thing that's off limits are civilians, which will cause you to lose points every time you get a bit too trigger happy. And for a shopping mall to be the very first level of introduction into this game, it's a perfect fit. State of Emergency plays much like your typical beat 'em up style game would, but with a wide range of weapons and interactive items being strewn about each level. And safe to say, you won't be using your fists for very long. It's one of those games that can be highly repetitive if you sit and play it for too long, but if you're just looking to burn an hour of free time or to simply let out a bit of steam, this game is sure to satiate any gamer's craving for crime-based mayhem. It's one of those titles that has continued to intrigue me since my childhood and is a game that I recommend any fan of beat 'em ups to play at least once. You gotta give Rockstar their flowers for supplying us with so much virtual debauchery in the early 2000s. And to say that State of Emergency played a huge role in their controversy as a studio would be an understatement. Plus, what is it with them and unstable men in Hawaiian shirts? I swear, Rockstar loves them.
I like this shirt.
But long story short, it's a game worth experiencing. So if you've been looking for something simple yet menacing to sink your teeth into, I say, have at it. Just don't forget your trusty medieval sword at home. It could definitely be coming in handy. As I previously stated in my part 1 video of this series, the Grand Theft Auto franchise was one of the most influential series of its generation, spawning many alike games in its wake, but with many falling incredibly short. But much like our previous mention of The Getaway, taking GTA's influence and creating something much more serious and cinematic, this next title on our list was looking to up the ante in the world of crime-based gaming, going all the way back to the year of 1999. The very first game in the Driver series was released on the PlayStation 1, boasting stunning visuals, addictive gameplay, and an in-depth replay editor. Driver was widely acclaimed for these features and had quickly become a favorite in the realm of action driving games. The sequel, Driver 2, had continued on the traditions of its predecessor, but this time including the option of exiting the vehicle and being able to roam freely around the city and hijack other vehicles on the road. And by the way, this was all available a year before GTA 3 had even been released, so it seemed like Driver was making big moves in its genre, and both games were favored well among critics. But with the release of their third entry, Driver 3, things were looking to get a bit more controversial. Released on June 21, 2004, Driver 3 was an open-world action game with ambitions to create something both unique and cinematic. The game's story follows the series' familiar protagonist of John Tanner, an FBI agent who is sent to investigate a suspected cartel and their alleged involvement in a car theft operation. Tanner ends up going undercover and posing as a wheelman for the cartel, earning the trust of its leader, Khalida Martinez, and furthering the game's crime-soaked narrative. It's a very serious look into the underground world of cartels and the many extracurriculars in which they partake in, and the story is guided by beautifully scripted cutscenes the whole way through. The game carries a serious, sometimes dark tone to it, and is even further complemented by its carefully chosen soundtrack. Basically what I'm getting at is the gameplay is much like a movie, and it's one that's well worth a watch, if I'm speaking from experience of course. All of the cliche GTA-inspired features are present in Driver 3, but the presentation of this game really stands on its own. There are over 70 different vehicles to either commandeer or collect throughout the game, all with their own specified weight and feel to them. The development team at Atari had also ensured that each vehicle would remain unique, with their own engine sounds and handling, making the driving feel impactful and giving its players more than enough option to find a favorite. Driver 3 was also the first in the series to include shooting and gunplay mechanics, as well as new vehicle types being added, such as boats and motorcycles. And of course, they had to make sure there was a return of its widely beloved Film Director mode. The Film Director feature allowed its players to record gameplay of their driving, adjust camera angles, and set up movie scenes for their cinematic masterpieces. It was a feature that I enjoyed toying around with a bunch as a kid, and many of Driver's fans have even created their own short films using these features. But despite all of these seemingly positive changes, the reception on Driver 3 was a bit more mixed this time around. Many of its critics were pushing speculation on the game trying to become something it's not. And as you can imagine, with a lot of crime-based games that were coming out around this time, anything open world was going to be compared to GTA, as it was the most commercially successful franchise of its genre. But just as we had stated before, the concept of open world gaming and free roam mechanics were really nothing new to the Driver series, as they had been making use of that style of gameplay since the year 2000. But because it wasn't as appealing to the masses or carried the same likable charm as its competition, Driver 3 is one of those games that was severely overlooked in its time. By no means am I saying it's a perfect game, as it's far from flawless. But when you really take the time to appreciate the attention to detail in almost every aspect of this game, you'll begin to see what I'm talking about. Starting with the game's 3 different locales, the story will have you traversing from the sunny shores of Miami Beach to more overseas locations such as Nice and Istanbul. All of these locations were heavily researched by the team at Atari, with over 90,000 photos being taken to document every little detail of their landscapes. The game made use of professional voice actors and celebrities such as Michael Madsen and Michelle Rodriguez for their characters. And I gotta say, Michael Madsen's voice is an incredible choice for the narration of this game. Just take a listen.
The strong-willed, untalkative man at odds with the world around him. Cold, efficient, maybe even ruthless and obsessive.
And not only that, but the game's soundtrack composed by Mark Canham is incredible and really captures the gritty essence in which this game provides. Overall, I'm one of those guys that always loved Driver 3, and getting to revisit it for this video just reminded me that much more. So by some chance you've yet to give it a play or have been hesitant to do so in the past, now's your chance. Just don't forget to wear your seatbelt, because it's sure to be a bumpy ride. The PlayStation 2 release was obviously one of the biggest moments in gaming history, leading the charge in 6th generation advances and giving fans of its predecessor an optimistic look into the future. While the PS2 is regarded as one of the most prolific consoles of all time, many were critical on the number of games that were available upon release. While a lot of these launch titles are still regarded as certified classics for many gamers across the globe, at that time, you'd be surprised how many were complaining of the PS2's limited roster. But throughout this small list of launch titles, one certain game had always shined for me personally, and is one that I'm happy to include in this video. That game being Smuggler's Run. Now this is a game that has flown under the radar quite a bit, with many people either forgetting of its existence or just never knowing it existed at all. So I thought I'd take the liberty of recapping one of Rockstar's most underrated games of the early 2000s and showcase all of its crime-ridden goodness. Now the plot of Smuggler's Run is pretty obvious. You're a smuggler who is tasked with transporting illegal goods and other contraband across many unforgiving landscapes. And throughout each mission, you'll be given a wide selection of different vehicles to make use of in getting the job done. It's a simple concept and plays very similar to Crazy Taxi, but with criminals instead of taxi drivers, of course. The game includes a campaign mode as well as multiplayer and free roam modes, allowing you to sharpen your driving and see who's got the best smuggling skill in your friend group. But going back to the campaign mode, it's very vague in its presentation. But that didn't stop Rockstar from including some cheesy B-movie style cutscenes to laugh at, of course. But in the game's narrative, you take on the role of a free agent smuggler who will work for many different organizations throughout the campaign mode. From the Russians to the CIA, no stone is left unturned when it comes to your resume, as you'll take on any job that's willing to pay. And while it is essentially the same pick up and deliver missions over and over, the intensity of each mission is really what makes the game so addicting. For some missions, it's as simple as locating the contraband and taking it to its destination, while in others, you'll find yourself running from police and even competing with other smugglers to intercept cargo. And when it comes to the more competitive missions with other teams looking to compete for each delivery, that's where the game really shone for me. It plays much like an intense game of Capture the Flag, but with souped up off-road vehicles. Nice. It's an addicting formula and one that I was happy to revisit again after many decades. And while the existence of Smuggler's Run is a bit foggy in the memory of many a gamer, for me personally, it felt like it was one of the better titles available at the PS2's launch. It's a game that took a crime-based concept and made it into something very easy to pick up and play. And whether alone or with a friend, Smuggler's Run is sure to satiate any adrenaline junkies' need for fast-paced gameplay. And for those Nintendo lovers out there, an even better version of the game is available on GameCube called Smuggler's Run Warzones, and it includes new vehicle types, levels, and abilities to play around with. I actually used this version in my recent playthrough of the game, and even as a PlayStation fanboy, I gotta say, I definitely prefer Warzones over the original. So if you ever find yourself itching for something a little more fast-paced with some highly illegal subject matter, Smuggler's Run is sure to be the game for you. So stay frosty, my friends, and safe travels. Now this next game on our list is truly something special. A game that encapsulates an era that is very sacred to me and is easily one of the most creative titles I've ever played. Developed by The Collective and published by Atari, comes Mark Echo's Getting Up. A game that puts you in the shoes of an amateur graffiti artist named Train on his journey to overcome tyranny through means of artistic expression. Or in legal terms, graffiti. The game's narrative begins with a beautifully scripted cutscene of Train explaining the newfound oppression in his city of New Radius, and reminiscing on how things used to be so much more alive where he came from. The oppression stems from the tyrannical state of government New Radius is falling under, with violence being used to suppress those in poverty, and gentrification being the agenda for their evil plan. It's a very serious and deep subject for a game about street art, but it works incredibly well in giving you a genuine purpose while playing. Now first and foremost, this game is loaded with talent, with Talib Kweli being the voice of Train, along with many other celebs such as Adam West, Brittany Murphy, and Rosario Dawson, all having participating roles in the game. The soundtrack is everything you could ask for in a game so heavily steeped in hip-hop culture, with legendary artists such as Mobb Deep and the Notorious B.I.G. all having their own tracks in-game. But enough about the talent. How does it play? Well, it's surprisingly refreshing. If I had to fit Getting Up into a genre, I would say it's a wonderful mix of platforming and beat 'em up, as you'll find yourself scaling buildings in search of tags and fighting rival gangs and police. The use of melee weapons such as baseball bats are available, but the game really shines in its hand-to-hand combat. A litany of combos can be used to take down your foes, with new moves being learned as you progress. I was really shocked at how much fun I had with the fighting, and I was kinda worried they would have made it in a much simpler fashion. But the punches you throw and take have a real impact to them, and I really enjoyed the majority of combat situations I found myself in. But on to the most important part of the game and our primary objective, the graffiti. The tagging system is easy to pick up on, but provides a creative way to make your tags, with R1 being used to lock onto the wall and the left stick being used to guide the paint. A drip meter is implemented to ensure you're shaking your can of spray paint effectively, and you can also keep a black book of different tags, giving you the ability to learn new art and switch things up for something refreshing. It's essentially a more complex version of the tagging in Jet Set Radio, but it's much more patient this time around and really helps with the immersion in game. Now speaking of immersion, I absolutely love the level design in this game. The city of New Radius is heavily inspired by New York City and really does an amazing job at mimicking the city that never sleeps. The atmosphere feels cold and hopeless, only further supporting the dystopic setting of the game's narrative. And what's a game about graffiti if it doesn't pay homage to some of the most legendary tagging artists of all time? Getting Up does a great job at including the works of some of the most infamous street artists, as our main character Train really looks up to these artists. Now, as with the majority of games that I cover, I never like to include any spoilers, but you've got to trust me when I say this is an underrated classic. Few games have ever been able to pay homage to hip hop and street culture in a way that Getting Up does, and I was honestly surprised it wasn't just a gimmicky cash grab. This is a game that is dripping with style, and was carefully crafted in a way that still holds up in present day. Although some of the control schemes may be a bit outdated at times, it's easy to pick up on, and even easier to get lost in. So if you find yourself with an insatiable craving for vandalism and have a few hours to burn, definitely fire this game up on one of your future gaming sessions. In terms of crime-based games, it's one of the more unique offerings of its era, and carries a unique nostalgia to it that just never seems to get old. Enjoy. If you were one of those beautiful souls who had watched my part 1 video of this series, then you've probably already scoffed at me for having left out the next game on our list. But because so many of you commented and countlessly reminded me of how great this game was, it's only right that I included it in this video. So folks, as most of you know, True Crime Streets of LA is probably the #1 contender of titles that were being compared to the likes of the GTA series. But after a closer inspection and getting a refreshed perspective of the game after almost 2 decades, I can confidently say True Crime Streets of LA proudly stands on its own 2 feet. Released on November 4th, 2003, everyone at this time was given the opportunity to jump into the world of true crime and experience its action-packed yet wacky approach to open-world gaming. The game's story follows Nick Kang, a loose cannon detective who finds himself in the middle of an investigation with deep ties to his father's disappearance. As previously mentioned, Nick is a bit of a wild card and prefers to handle things in a more unconventional way than your typical lawman. With his reputation preceding him, he's paired with a reluctant detective by the name of Rosie Velasco. While getting acquainted with one another over dinner, Nick spots a triad member attempting to extort the owner of the restaurant, which leads to a brawl in the restaurant, ending with Rosie being shot and wounded. This points Nick in the direction of investigating the triad for the series of bombings that have been taking place in the city, and also opens up a whole new can of worms into the past of his father. It's not the greatest story ever told by any means, but obviously where the game shines is in its gameplay. Much like GTA, you're allowed to willingly roam the open landscape, which is in fact an over 240 square mile recreation of Los Angeles, with many details such as street names and landmarks being faithful to their source material. You can hijack vehicles, cause mayhem in the streets, and do pretty much everything else that was found in GTA. But in this game, you're a cop, so committing such acts will result in your badge rating being lowered, and harming civilians in any way will cost you big time. So you're better off making use of your time in more positive ways, such as solving the many random crimes across the city, as well as tracking down and arresting suspects. It's a great twist on the GTA formula, and is one that also introduces a litany of dope mechanics to toy around with. The use of a bullet time feature is implemented for the wide range of gun battles you'll be partaking in, as well as a pretty great targeting system, allowing you to either lock onto your enemies or take more precise shots. This mechanic can also be used in vehicles, which makes certain chase sequences all the more exciting. The combat mechanics for hand-to-hand battles are also incredibly fun, with a variety of finishing moves and a Tekken-style blocking system to keep things refreshing. And with the use of other mechanics such as human shields and slow-mo, this game is almost like a beautiful fusion of both Dead to Rights along with GTA. And while you would think that any controversy pertaining to this game would have to involve the Grand Theft Auto series, you'd be mistaken. Only 2 weeks prior to the release of True Crime, an American novelist by the name of Robert Kreis had filed a lawsuit against Activision, stating the developers had copied the concept of the game's main character Nick Kang from the main protagonist in Kreis's Elvis Cole novels. He was basically saying they stole the concept of Nick's character from his books, and was seeking to prevent Activision in releasing the game. But after getting a chance to review the development team's hard work behind the scenes, and even finding that their lead developer was actually a fan of Mr. Christ, he decided to drop the lawsuit entirely, and even wrote the game a pretty good review on his website. So as you know, the game eventually launched, and despite this controversy and speculation on it being just another GTA clone, the game was actually met with some pretty great reviews, with most critics noting its greatest strengths to be in the generous amount of cool features included in-game, as well as the accurate representation of LA. And while it wasn't the most thought out story or even the most likable roster of characters, with Snoop Dogg being the exception of course, True Crime had a certain B-movie-esque charm to it that many have grown to appreciate over the years. It was probably the best game of its kind to compete with the likes of GTA. Despite its clunky control schemes and sometimes degraded visuals, it's still a game very much worth revisiting in present day. So saving the best for last, I hope you all enjoyed this video, and please comment down below any games you'd like to see me cover in the future. I may even continue this series with a part 3. But anyways, we've got a hot one coming up next, and I can't wait to show you guys what I have in store. So thank you for your continued support, and I hope to see you all in the next video. Until next time, peace out guys. Take care.